I was there, Gandalf. I was there 3,000 years ago.
But before we get started, I would like to take a moment and thank everyone for watching my first run of videos on this channel. I wanted to have my setup ready to decently produce videos. However, after seeing the press releases and the trailer for The Rings of Power, I felt it necessary to release this multi-part content as soon as possible. Now on with the show. Within hours of Variety's release of the Rings of Power preview, fan hit pieces were published on the internet. These articles not only attacked Tolkien fans by claiming they were just against diversity, but also set up diversity as changes bringing the real world into Tolkien's world. Obviously, Amazon knew they would receive backlash since these articles released shortly after the preview. Unfortunately, these preemptive attacks not only alienated the fan base, but also ensured any diversity additions to the show will break the show's immersion, which I'll cover these in future videos. Be advised, all may not be lost. There may be some hope left, so in my last video, I'll cover why this may be. Sifting through social media, I saw many people argue against critics by bringing up critiques that were either made or not made during the release of the original trilogy. For this first video, I will dive into how fans reacted to the original trilogy back then and how it relates to today. The first part will be Eowyn and the killing of the Witch King. This old argument mentioned in social media, an attempt to point to fans' hypocrisy of supporting strong women characters back then compared to being supportive of strong women characters today in shows like The Rings of Power's version of Galadriel. Clearly this is false, and the fact is there's been minimum complaints back then with Eowyn's character because that's just how she was portrayed in the books. Eowyn's slaying of the Witch King was not only canon, but it was one of the examples of Tolkien's writing of a strong female character and giving her a meaningful story with a heroic ending without sacrificing her femininity. In the books, Eowyn is an example of how good writing can create a female protagonist without ham-fisting feminist ideas in, which really is the only gripe of the character back then in the movie. Fans argue that the character's book dialogue was cut down and edited in order to push an idea that her whole story and thought process was that she was being downplayed for just being a woman without putting up a fight. This argument is valid because it's one of the few times that Jackson changed text just in order to push a character in a different direction. But this wasn't needed because the feminism was already strong with Eowyn's book character. But yet, it fit in the overall story. I believe Jackson's intent was noble in this case. I think that he felt he was required to condense story arcs and make them more obvious because the books in general were being condensed into these 3 movies. Which brings me to another argument made in the trilogy in which social media has pointed to an example of Tolkien fans having always been misogynistic. Eowyn, the warrior princess. This issue was probably one of the biggest, and the funny thing was, it was coming from popular Tolkien groups. More about that in later videos. The issue I'm talking about is that of Arwen's character. Now, like I said in the beginning, I'm a casual fan, a normie, so my knowledge is limited to reading the books a few times and watching the movies a whole bunch of times. But from what I remember from the books, Eowyn was pretty much stuck at home while other characters ran off to save the world. Kind of reminds me of those stories or movies that start with a knight hanging in a castle with the princess. Then he gets called to some heroic quest. He gives the princess a kiss. He ends up leaving, goes off, does his heroic deeds. We don't see the princess until the end where the knight comes home victorious and they kiss again and they get married. They live happily ever after. That's kind of the story in the books I remember for Eowyn. Back when the original trilogy was made, rumors began swirling that Eowyn was seen a lot more in the movies than she was in the books. And when the trailer of The Fellowship was released, fans were quickly in an uproar, and for understandable reasons. Not only was Eowyn present in the trailer, but she was seen riding a horse, she was shown with a sword, so fans not only see more Eowyn than they did in the books, they were also seeing a different character altogether, or as we thought. In Jackson's defense, he was creating an epic trilogy of the movies with an unprecedented $300 million budget. An epic that needs mass appeal would have definitely required a love story in it. To stay true to the books, and the most logical love story to include would be that of Aragorn and Eowyn. I talked my wife into seeing The Fellowship after showing the movies, shots, and it included Orlando Bloom, and others, and my wife went into that movie waiting for Legolas to show up. But by the time she left the movie, all she could talk about was the love story of Aragorn and Eowyn. She watched and enjoyed the entire trilogy, mostly to see what would happen with that couple. In order for Jackson to make an epic love story for an epic movie, he would need to have Eowyn interact with Aragorn a lot more. With the movie already bloated to the max with Tolkien's book material, Jackson could not just add new content. His only option was for Eowyn to be present and partially involved in some of Aragorn's scenes, where in the books, she wasn't. And as for the warrior princess, quote-unquote, worries, most fans came around after watching the films. Yes, she used the sword to sneak up on Aragorn. Yes, she rode a horse while lifting a sword above her head. But honestly, Tyler portrayed the character in a way that kind of looked like Eowyn wasn't well trained in the art of sword fighting. I mean, she's thousands of years old. I'm sure she would have learned how to at least pick up the sword in her lifetime. I felt the movie Eowyn ended up being more like her book Eowyn and a lot less than like a warrior princess. Let's just be happy Jackson removed the Eowyn fighting scene from Helm's Deep. So fans and Tolkien groups had problems with Eowyn before the trilogy came out. And because most changed their minds after they saw the movies, some defenders of the Rings of Power say the critics today are again jumping the gun. The problem is most movies and TV shows today have not been true to the IP that they own, and who knows what Arwen's character would have been like if fans weren't speaking up or if the Tolkien scholars were silent. The time crunch. I know there's a lot of past complaints about the original trilogy, but I wanted to go over just one last one. The complaint was that of a condensed story and leaving too much material out of the movies. Obviously, Jackson would not have been able to fit the entirety of the books into just 3 movies. At the time, movies were usually cut to 2 hours long, but the studios knew the size and scope of the project, so they gave Jackson room to extend it to 3 hours. Fans complained that crucial material was missing and characters were left out of the movies. But this was really out of Jackson's hands due to that unwritten 3-hour max rule. Fans were suggesting at the time that maybe Lord of the Rings should be a television series instead. However, at that time, streaming services were not really a thing, and television would have not nearly the budgeted $300 million that Jackson had to develop the movies. We would have not gotten as good of an end product, visually or acting-wise, in a television show at that time. It makes you wonder, if Amazon budgeted $1 billion for 5 whole seasons, why would they have condensed 2,000 years into just 200? Word from the showrunners is they did this so that they can keep the human characters throughout the show without them dying. Not only does this point to Amazon changing the story to fit the characters that they created, but also cannot be dismissed by Amazon by claiming that it's just bigotry of fans. The conclusion. So as you can see, there are plenty of issues that Tolkien fans had, and some still have, with the original trilogy. You may be asking why I didn't cover the Hobbit trilogy. And that's because I found that the gripes in the Hobbit trilogy were similar to the original trilogy. I also think that the Hobbit trilogy paled in comparison to the original as far as movie quality. Jackson tried his best to create an extended story from the Hobbit book, but still stayed true to Tolkien's lore. That's something I don't see Amazon pulling off. I'm under the impression the Rings of Power will be of Hobbit quality, but instead of extending off Tolkien's lore, it'll be a subverted story to fit the characters that they created and the characters that, in their own words, quote, reflect the actual world, unquote. Again, this is the first part in a series of videos about the Rings of Power. We have information coming in constantly as these are being developed. For this first one, I wanted to delve into prior complaints of adapted works of Tolkien's books so that we can compare yesterday to today. Hopefully by looking into the past, we can help the future. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, again, please subscribe and smash that like button.